Today, I have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Shauna Hanisch-Kirkbride. Shauna grew up in Vancouver, Washington before attending the University of Montana in Missoula, where she earned a Bachelor of Science degree in wildlife biology. Shauna went on to earn her master's degree in public administration from Boise State with an environmental and natural resource policy emphasis. During her time at Boise State, Shauna came to know and respect John Freemuth, first as her advisor and later as a student in his Master of Public Administration classes. She appreciated his perspective that environmental and natural resource issues weren't just about science and facts. The lessons learned in his classes and in the MPA program in general were a great supplement to an education in the natural sciences. John was a big part of that, opinionated but open-minded and adept at seeing things from different angles. They went on to keep in touch over the years, even after she graduated and moved away. Shauna went on to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Arlington, Virginia. She said that the MPA she earned from Boise State was a big factor in helping her land that position, as it made her more well-rounded and able to see natural resource issues more holistically. She was hired to work on double-crested cormorant management, a controversial value-laden issue that was a natural fit for the lessons learned in her wildlife biology and MPA studies. The culmination of those years with the Fish and Wildlife Service was a major environmental impact statement and rulemaking that resulted in new policy allowing states and tribes to manage problematic fish-eating birds with less federal oversight, but still ensuring conservation of the species. After 10 years working in the federal government, Shauna then went on to graduate school at Michigan State University, where she earned a PhD in fisheries and wildlife with an emphasis in human dimensions. She became a professor of environmental science at a small private college in Midland, Michigan, until she relocated back to Vancouver, Washington in 2018. Shauna now works with the in the nonprofit sector as the managing director of the Lower Columbia Fish Enhancement Group, where she works with a staff of 5 to restore salmon habitat in watersheds across the Lower Columbia River region. Shauna and her husband have 3 dogs and 3 cats and are avid hikers and campers. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today. And I'm looking forward to your talk, and I'll pass it on to the next person.
All right, guys. Today I have the opportunity to introduce Scott Martin to the class. Like all of us, Scott has studied at Boise State, both for his undergraduate and postgraduate degree. He was lucky enough to have John Freemuth as his advisor. We learned much about this semester. More recently, he has been performing his role as the executive director of River Heritage Conservancy, which is right now they're working on a park in Ohio on the banks of the Ohio River in Louisville, and it's 600 acres, big park, and they're focused on conserving this stretch of land and its natural beauty for future generations. Not only that, but before COVID and all the travel restrictions happened, he was serving a 3-year stint as the North American Chair for World Urban Parks, where he travels around the world giving advice, talks to groups who are having interest on working on park projects. One of the challenges he faces in his day-to-day work and operations is just getting people to act on ideas, that are like widely appreciated, but taking action just hasn't happened yet. Some examples he gave me was like, what if you could swim in the Ohio River and if it was safe? What if I used my car less every day? What if I relied on it less, and other stuff like that? And just thanks for coming in and giving us a presentation today.
Good morning, everyone. Today I have the pleasure of introducing one of our guest speakers today, Kelli Badesheim, which I hope I pronounced correctly. Kelli grew up in Boise and now lives in Eagle, and she has 3 children who she has also raised in the Boise area. She received her bachelor's in psychology and then went on to get her master's in public administration from Boise State. Kelli realized very early on into her degree that it was a good fit for her own interests and career goals. In her opinion, her master's in public administration married the theoretical with the practical quite nicely. Being able to interact and network with the public sector professionals within the program has been very beneficial to her career. She has been involved in public administration and public transportation for 25 years. Kelli is the executive director of Valley Regional Transit, which is the regional public transportation authority for Ada and Canyon counties in Idaho. Kelli works for a 29-member board of directors and oversees a public authority with 44 employees who support the administration, planning, and oversight of the public transportation services in the region. When asked what a typical day looks like for her, she replied that she does not have any typical days. Kelli works a lot with local elected officials and community stakeholders to coordinate and collaborate on a variety of public transportation related initiatives. She states that there is very little that happens in a community that somehow isn't connected to transportation. Over the last several years, Kelli has looked for ways to help communities understand the role of public transportation in supporting a variety of connected systems, such as our education, health systems, economic development, and etc. In her free time, she enjoys baking, running, and going camping. She also serves on the board of the United Way and the Western Idaho Community Health Collaborative. Please join me in welcoming Kelli to the class.
Hey everybody, I'm Shannon. I have the pleasure of introducing a BSU alumni, Craig Jones, as one of the speakers in the panel today. He is the Director of Environmental Policy at Oglethorpe Power Corporation. In this position, he focuses on environmental studies regarding state, regional, and national issues. He is primarily focused on energy and climate policy, hydro relicensing, and industry electrification trends. During his career timeline, he has managed to manage corporate environmental compliance and numerous federal hydro relicensing projects in the west part of the world. He has also developed resource planning PERPA piercing models. His perspective is national. He loves the field of work that he's in, and he's been focused on these issues for about 2 whole decades now. When I asked him what inspired him to work in this field, he told me that he wanted to better understand policy issues and to get a better grasp on current issues. It was not easy, but the struggle was worth it to him. With his extensive experience with the electrical utility industry, he is able to help out lots of people. He now holds a PhD in public policy and administration with an emphasis on energy and environmental policy. He also has a Master of Public Administration and has a bachelor's degree in economics. All of these degrees came from BSU, and I'm eager to hear about what he has to say today.
Thank you, Shannon, Stephanie, Alyssa, and Riley for those great introductions. Please join me in welcoming our panel, either loudly or silently, wherever you are. And we're going to run the panel a little bit like we did when we had Emilio here, and that is that I will ask them questions and give them the opportunity to respond to those questions. So we'll go sort of back and forth like that for about half an hour, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll allow students to follow up with their own questions. So I'd like to start a little bit backwards, and I'd like to ask our panelists to tell us a little bit more. We heard magnificent bios and a really deep well of expertise that you all have developed over time, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about the work that you're doing now and how you see that work informing environmental research and policy in particular. So our standard class rules continue. If you're not talking, please go ahead and stay on mute so we don't hear your dogs or the doorbells. If you have a question, feel free to pop it up in the chat and we'll reserve that towards the end. But if you're a speaker, you don't have to respond to those chat questions when they come up. And finally, remember that you're being recorded and potentially future students will be watching this as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and start with our panel, and maybe Craig, since your bio came last, maybe we'll have you go first and tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing now.
Sure, thanks, Emily. And Shannon, thank you for the introduction. I really appreciate that. It's an honor to be here today, and especially an honor to be able to address this class with John Freeman's memory in all of our hearts and minds. And he was a fantastic professor, a good friend. What I'm doing now in my work is really it's looking at national regulations and national legislation, really focused on climate policy. And when I think about my years back with the MPA program, the reason why I got into that was really to better understand how decisions are made, why they're made the way they are. I'm a bit of an outsider to the public space. I've always been in private industry. And so I've got 2 degrees that are really public entity focused. And the reason why I have those is to really understand the public process, because when we're talking about natural resources, we are talking about public resources. And it matters how we make decisions about those. And there are stakeholders with diverse values, and every single one of those values matters. So what I'm really paying attention to is how the regulations are made, why they're made the way they are, why they end up being what they are as opposed to something else, why there's a void at the federal level in climate legislation, what's contributed to that. And then with my own research, it's really focused on why is climate policy implemented through regulation at the federal level and not through legislation, and what impacts that has. So for example, under the Obama administration, they implemented rules to limit CO2 emissions. Under the Trump administration, those rules were replaced with something that was less impactful to CO2 emissions. And now under the Biden administration, what we anticipate is we'll be back to a regulatory framework where there are stricter regulations on CO2 limits. So acting through administrative action it definitely creates a dynamic that is unstable and creates uncertainty around how we actually address these important issues. And I'll just go ahead and pause there and let others jump in with their stuff. Thanks, Emily.
Thank you, Craig. Let's go ahead to Shauna next. And if you could answer the same question, what's the work that you're doing now and how do you see it relevant to folks in this class?
Yeah, sure. And again, like Craig, thanks for being here. It's an honor. I have really fond memories of my time at Boise State and taking classes from John and others. And I apologize in advance for any animal noises in the background. As you heard, we have kind of a zoo. So I'm currently managing director of one of 14 regional fisheries enhancement groups in the state of Washington. And what our group does, we're the lower Columbia region, so Southwest Washington. And essentially we do salmon habitat restoration. My particular position is I wear a lot of hats. I'm sort of I do everything from budgeting and financial management to, some like legislative advocacy. I'm kind of growing in that role because I'm still fairly new, 2 years in this position, managing staff. I created our website. I mean, it covers the gamut because we're a small organization. I'm not sure, I know Scott's also in the nonprofit world. I'm not sure how big his staff is, but we have a staff of 5. And they're really sort of the environmental professionals in a way. I have that background, so I know enough to be kind of dangerous, but I really, my job now is management. But our organization, we do really cool stuff. It's essentially we're boots on the ground restoration practitioners. We go out in streams and rivers that need some improved, enhanced habitat because of different practices that have influenced them over the years, from putting dead fish out in the river to sort of recreate the natural cycle of salmon because the returning fish aren't as abundant as they once were, to putting large wood in streams, which helps create habitat complexity for salmon, But yeah, really our role is just, that's sort of the habitat piece of the puzzle is where we fit in with the, the whole big picture of, hydro, hatcheries, all that stuff that affects salmon. So we do the habitat side. And I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shauna. Let's go Kelli and then Scott.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I was thinking about as kind of my pathway, I actually started in nonprofit. That's where I was before I did the MPA and then went to government. So I was actually doing social work prior to doing the MPA program. I was doing working with families that were in the youth justice, social justice system, the social services, and did a lot of family mediation. And all those skills I have to use all the time now, only at the local government level, because we're always trying to work through really sticky issues. All the easy things got solved years ago, and now we have nothing left but really sticky, difficult issues to solve. So the MPA program for me was, and this is one of the influences I think for me with that I had from John Freemuth is his ability to really take these very theoretical kind of policy ideas, but then apply them in really practical ways, because ultimately that's what it's all about in government, is you have to find practical solutions to really sticky problems. So some of the things that I'm working on now that are related to this conversation is everything we do somehow informs environmental policy, because public transportation is a public service that provides a more efficient way for us to move people, a more environmentally sound way to move people. We're in the process of a huge electric bus, for us, a huge electric bus procurement. We're going to be launching electric vehicles in our transit system starting in the spring this year. So we're pretty excited about that. A lot of the other environmental issues we work on are around social justice and environmental justice, and making sure that all populations have a voice and can be engaged and access to good transportation so that they can get to jobs and education, healthcare, and all those important life activities. I think that as far as the things that I do a mix of staff kind of technical level work and policy level work. So I'm constantly having to shift back and forth between those two things. And I think the MPA program really helped sharpen my skills to be able to do that. And I don't know that I would be able to do it as effectively as I think I'm able to do it, because without having had that education. So I'll stop there and look forward to more questions.
Thank you so much, Kelli. Go for it, Scott.
Let's see here, unmute. It's really neat to be here doing this on behalf of Freemuth, and no one has cussed yet, so it really doesn't feel legitimately Freemuth yet. I shall do my best. My current work is in land conservancy in the urban setting, because here's the reason. By 2050, 7 out of 10 of us are going to live in cities. And the front line of green lifestyles, of livable cities, we think is actually in the urban environment. And that's where I spend my time, and recognizing that making livable cities and great cities doesn't happen accidentally. You don't back into Ann Morrison Park or Julia Davis Park or the foothills. It requires a lot of intentionality. And what's neat about cities is we humans control a lot about what happens. So that's where I've elected to be here. I'll tell you, I was terrified of getting an MPA at first, because I was scared to death I would be incredibly boring and end up like a character out of Parks and Recreation or something. So I resisted that call, because meetings and bureaucracy scare me. But thanks to my experience in Boise, and quite frankly, the Boise brand, and the city of Boise has a great brand in terms of national relevance and placemaking and the work I work in. I've been able to ride that brand and those experiences in my time with John to do work globally and to do things I've had no business doing in rooms I've had no business sitting in. So the future that I see myself working on with the MPA is still in this urban frontier, figuring out how we don't screw things up, how Boise doesn't become Denver, how maybe it becomes Adelaide. and helping cities do this. And in our line of work, the future of this is not government. Government doesn't have the capacity, the financial willpower, the commitment to great design, the discipline to do the central parks in New York anymore. So we really see the model moving forward are these public-private partnerships where you bring the best of the private sector and the best of the public sector together, and you achieve really big stuff. Because at the end of the day, as parochial and as divided this nation may seem, I think one of the places everyone comes together is still urban parks. I think everyone, Republican, Democrat, Tea Party to Greenpeace, loves these urban parks. And if we get the stuff out of the way, we can still do some pretty awesome stuff. It's not just history.
Thank you, Scott. When I lived in Mexico City, I lived right around the corner from Chapultepec Park, the oldest park in the Americas, and spent time there almost every day. And you're right, it's a place where people come together, but it also has all of these other roles within it. So the next question I'd love to have our panel weigh in on is why you got an MPA to begin with, like what drew you to it? And alongside that, what advice would you give to students that may or may not be weighing an MPA versus law school or training in a traditional discipline? Because part of what's so exciting about this panel is we have social work, we have economics, right? We have biology. There's so many diverse and different disciplinary backgrounds that ended up in an MPA program. So I'm curious if you were drawn to the program for what you got out of it, or if you were drawn to it for a totally different reason, still ended up getting something out of that. So if you guys would be willing to reflect on that, and who wants to go first? Do we have someone who's eager to answer that? Shauna, awesome.
I'll go first. It's a little bit funny in how I ended up in the MPA program in one sense, because I was looking into the Masters of Raptor Biology program, and they were very close to each other in the catalog. And the MPA caught my eye, and I started looking at the courses. And I think that I actually called John Freemuth and talked to him about it. I had some questions. But I've always been interested in the human dimension side of things. I mean, I love biology and ecology, but I'm just kind of naturally a big picture thinker. And so I love the interdisciplinary side of it and the possibility of learning more about the policy side, because I realized pretty early on, I don't know why, just the way my brain works, that, understanding the policy process was going to be a big part of me having a career that I felt was meaningful. I didn't want to be a field biologist. I'd done it, in seasonal positions. I wasn't that good at it, really. Like, I don't enjoy that grudge of it. I love the outdoors, but I knew field work wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to have more of an impact. And also I figured being in the wildlife field, the natural resources, most likely I was going to work for government. That's where most of the jobs are. So understanding that process through the MPA program would really help me in my career. And it was a great decision. I struggled a little at the beginning with the shift from, biology and natural resources to stuff that was like political science and everything. But once you get into that groove, it was incredible. I mean, I learned so much, and it is absolutely, I would say, one of the best decisions that I made for me in my career. I don't know your stories and where you hope to be, but I can definitely speak for my experience that it was an incredible program, and I'm really glad that I went through it.
Thanks, Shauna. And I hope students are hearing that it's okay to change your mind, right? To be attracted to raptor biology, but to see something else that piques your interest and to go for it. Neat. Craig, do you want to go next?
Sure. First, though, Scott, you are a character in Parks and Recreation. Just want to set the record straight on that. But what drew me to the MPA program was really the policy. I mean, Shauna, for me, hit on it right there. And at the time, I was leading the relicensing effort for Idaho Power on multiple projects. And for those of you who don't know what hydro relicensing is, hydropower projects private hydropower projects are licensed by the federal government for a period of 50 years. And when they come to the end of that, then they need to go through a new process where the impacts of the project are identified and determined, and then measures are put in place for how the project should operate in the future. And when many of the projects were originally built in this country, they were built, 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years ago and longer. And so times change. And as times and laws change, so does the view on how those resources should be used. And so as I went through that process, it was like, this really is environmental policy. It's public policy, it's environmental policy. And so for me, it was really important to understand how those policy pieces moved. And when I think about attorneys that I've worked for, so why the MPA program, or why that focus rather than law school? Within law school, one, you've got to be well placed in order to be able to identify the area that you're going to work in. Let's say you want to work in natural resource and environmental law. It's not an easy field to get into. You've got a limited number of people who are actually going to practice law in that area. And then when you do practice law in that area, sometimes you get pigeonholed in certain areas of the law. So maybe you're just going to work on Section 210 of the Clean Water Act, and that's it. And you become a specialist on there, or the Clean Air Act, and you become a specialist in those areas. So I get to work with Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, all the policies and the laws around those that really, attorneys don't get to do. So I get to do a lot of the fun stuff that people who have law degrees in those areas do, and I still get to work with the law. And it takes a while to get there, but you can absolutely do it. So for me, it really was about understanding the really complex processes around how decisions are made in the public space, and not only from coming up with policies, but developing those policies, negotiating those policies, and then ultimately implementing those policies. So you get the full spectrum of policy development all the way through policy implementation.
Thank you, Craig. I think we'll let Scott go next if he has some things he'd like to say about the MPA.
No, I mean, it was terrifying because I literally was scared that it would be like a death spiral of a boring life. So I kind of did run away from it a bit because it really, yay, public administration. But it turned out to be the absolute right thing for me because, and I'm going to use a Freemuth line here. So I knew I wanted to work in parks, but in all due respect to parks people, it's a lot of balls and bats, y'all. And it cannot be the most thoroughly thought about approach. But if you look at the work of the great parks, and again, Frederick Law Olmsted with Central Park in New York, our great cities require interdisciplinary experience, an approach to landscape design, ecology, yes, human recreation, yes, transportation. And the best place for me to learn those skills was in an MPA program. And what also helped me is Craig and Shauna and I, we were all together. It was a magical time in my life, and I don't pull any punches there. Craig and I have talked literally for every week for the last 20 years, at least. And during football season, it's every day because we have issues to work out. And John Freemuth and I talk every week for 20 years. And these are the guys that through my highs and my lows, being kicked down, being lifted up, have helped me grow my skills and be better at my job. And I wouldn't have met them or worked with them without the MPA program. And what dovetailed with that for me was I was the staff person for the first Foothills campaign. Lauren McLean and I were the two staff people. And to do the Foothills campaign while in grad school with knuckleheads like Jonesy and Freemuth around gave me a breadth of experience that I will put up against any of the Ivy Leaguers that I'm stuck with back here every day. It just gave me that breadth of experience. So enough Baptist minister for me. I'll stop preaching.
Thanks, Scott. And Kelli, you already mentioned a little bit that you had an indirect path as well, but I'd be curious why you were drawn to the MPA and what advice you'd give for people that would like to follow in your footsteps.
Yeah, well, I wish I could say that there was this big career epiphany I had and I found my path that way, but really for me, it was more of a very practical decision. I knew I wanted a graduate degree and I wanted to stay in Boise. So I opened up the catalog and I found the degree that I could do that didn't require me to start from scratch. And it also aligned with a lot of my interests. So I started the MPA program. I also had the pleasure of working as a graduate assistant, a research assistant. So I got very embedded in the work very quickly. I did an internship in the mayor's office. So I think a lot of I kind of had this experience where I haven't really made career choices. I've taken career opportunities as they presented themselves. So when I was working in the mayor's office, I got to know the people at the transit system. And when a job opened at the transit system, I applied for that and have always found that the MPA, because of the breadth and depth of the topics, and because it had that nice mix of practical and theoretical, it has fit with every opportunity that's presented itself. So I felt ready, and when I decided to take on being the director of the Transit Authority, similar to Scott with his kind of decision about his MPA, going into an MPA program, I was also wondering, it was a way outside my comfort zone. I was going to have to actually work with elected officials that's policy level. And I think it was the fact that I'd had this educational background that it made me less resistant to try something new and to try kind of stretch beyond my comfort zone and do things as opportunities presented themselves.
Fantastic, thank you. So as you know, this has been a class on public lands, and there's been a large bit of history in there, like there would have been if John had taught it. And there has also been a lot of connections to public lands issues, whether they have to do with hydroelectric dams, with restoration of particular species, with issues of jurisdiction and land endowments, those types of things. But I'm wondering if you all could look in your crystal balls and say what you think an up and coming topic or an area you would recommend is going to be a place where issues about the environment come into their own in the next few years. And if you would give us a suggestion or some advice on an environmental issue that may or may not be related to public lands you think should keep their eyes on.
I'd like to jump in on that if I could, or I'm sorry.
Please. No, go ahead, Kelly. We'll go to Craig next.
I think about this all the time because, as I mentioned early on, there's so many ways that all these systems connect together when it comes to transportation. And what I've realized is that I started reading this book called Your Leadership Edge, and it sort of looks at the world or looks at problems through an adaptive lens versus a technical lens. So if I were to give advice to people who are starting out in their career and where this sort of next kind of generation work is going to be, is similar to what I think one of the previous panels said. It's in these public-private partnerships. Everything is way too complicated for any one sector to fix. So it's figuring out how to bring these diverse groups together who may seem like they have diverse interests, but really there are some common interests, and figuring out what are those common interests. And rather than focusing on finding the most perfect technical solution, how do we together find a solution where we're adapting to all the values and the cultures and the things people care about. And, I had this big aha, and I mentioned it the other day when we were visiting, about where the work that I do connects with the public lands work. I was at an Eagle City Council meeting, and we were talking about, they were having a meeting. There were 3 different presentations on the agenda that day. One was the police, and they were talking about needing more officers because the city was growing and there was not enough police officers to take care of the not just the number of people, but the way that the city had grown out so far, so really sprawled out. And then there was someone from the Federal Fish and Wildlife group, and they were talking about how important it is to design cities in a way so that we don't damage the riparian, and that there are ways of doing that in an urban planning arena so that we have these beautiful environmental features that we want in our communities. And then I got up and talked about transportation and how challenging it is to serve more sprawled areas and that sort of thing. And I was thinking how it would seem, just looking on the agenda, like people were going to hear 3 different presentations. They were really just hearing about the same thing from 3 different perspectives. And all of us had one common theme, and that is that our work is made more challenging because of the way cities are choosing or have been growing and developing. So I would say that's probably figuring out how these things fit together and coming up with more innovative, collaborative ways of solving problems than what maybe we were able to do 20 years ago.
Energy. E.F. Schumacher, an economist from the late 1960s, 1970s, said that energy is unlike any other commodity. It's actually the precondition of all commodities, equal to air, earth, and water. And the reason that's so is because everywhere that energy is expanded, social welfare also expands. And when you think about it, the greatest quality of life that everybody has in the world comes from an expanded and efficient use of electricity. And it goes back to how we use energy. Now, that being said, there are all kinds of issues related to energy. And when I take that to public lands and think about where the conversation goes right now, it's, well, what do we want to replace fossil fuels with? Number one, there are a good chunk of fossil fuels that come from public lands through extraction, whether it's coal or oil or fracking. Those are important issues that we have to deal with. Gas is an important issue if you care about reducing CO2 emissions, because gas is the only resource right now that can efficiently replace coal. So you still have to have gas in order to get to a transition to a low carbon future, until you could come up with technologies that can actually get you there. So if that's the direction you want to go, the extraction of natural gas on both private and public lands is going to be important. And when you put those windmills and those solar arrays out, where are you going to put them? Where you have lots of wide open space. You've got lots of wide open spaces on public lands. But now you have to have transmission to get those to the population areas. So unless you do completely distributed energy, where you've got solar panels in cities and solar arrays and things like that are near cities, you have to get the energy there. When you use transmission, you're going to be cutting across public lands, private lands, all kinds of different lands. These are big issues. And this is why in the public space and public lands that these issues can get contentious. And I remember one of the things that has always stuck with me from what John Freeman said early on in one of his classes, public lands class. He said, people come by their values honestly. And when they do that, and because they do, you need to honestly engage with those values. Now, you may not agree with everybody's value, but they do come by it honestly, and that deserves a level of respect, a level of discourse and deliberation on how to work through these issues. It's incredibly important. It's something that we don't really see in today's environment, but if it were there, I think we would be much better off in terms of our decision-making processes. The other thing is that when you think about public lands and the diverse interests, it's easy to stereotype. And one of the readings that I recommended was the Nisbet article on disruptive ideas. And what that does, and that is actually probably not nuanced enough, but public lands, environmental policy, all of those issues are incredibly nuanced. And it's important to understand those nuances so that we don't fall into the trap of just stereotyping interests. And it's not climate alarmism versus climate denialism. There are all kinds of interests in between there to understand how the decisions are actually being made when it comes to climate change. The same is true for every issue with public lands. So, but for me, there isn't a more interesting or complex, fascinating topic than energy in the public space.
Thank you. Shauna, what do you think?
So I have my list of issues that are currently and will continue to be controversial and difficult to deal with. Wildfire, that's a huge one. I'm just outside of Portland, Oregon, and here in Vancouver, we had a solid week of smoke this summer. It was terrible because we had fires to the south of us, to the north of us. And that kind of ties to climate change, and for me, thinking of it through a bit of a, salmon and fisheries lens, you think of, changing hydrological patterns and less snow in the winter and how that affects the water availability over the course of the summer, which affects drought, which affects fire, right? These things are all connected. Craig mentioned energy, which is, he's right. That's a huge issue. And I love E.F. Schumacher, by the way. So thanks for the nod to that. Small is Beautiful. Read that book. But, here we have the challenge of, we want to have low carbon emissions. We have a great source of hydropower on the Columbia River, the Snake River, but it's terrible for our fish, so you have that challenge of like, how do you balance, there's a lot of growing talk of removing some of these dams, especially on the Snake River. But in an era where we're trying to deal with carbon and our footprint, that's a tough decision to make. So energy, I would also add overcrowding on public lands. That's another thing here in the Portland area. So many people love the outdoors, love to hike. You go to a national forest trailhead on a summer Saturday, and it's for me, because I was away for almost 20 years, to see it now, it's kind of shocking how many people are there. So you have to really plan that, and that it's frustrating. And then human wildlife coexistence, that's one that's really near and dear to my heart, having a wildlife background. But, you think of these situations in bigger cities where you have, mountain lions that or coyotes, that's a big one, right? Eating people's pets, especially this like charismatic megafauna, the wolves, the grizzlies. How do we manage, keeping them around without causing a lot of problems for humans? And then I think also kind of tied back to the overcrowding thing, thinking about local lands and acquisition. If I were rich, I would be buying land like crazy. But we can't just rely on our national forests and we tend to think of federal lands, but local governments need to be buying land. We're doing it quite a bit here in Clark County, Washington, but there's never enough, because it really is a race for development versus protection. And I think that's really important too.
I guess I'm last of very smart people. Amen, amen, amen. Look, the problems you're going to confront are going to be different than the ones that we did, that are different than the ones our parents did. 20 years ago, they were scared to death about the red menace and nuclear bombs coming in from Russia. 50 years ago, we were worried about polio. So I'm the optimistic in the bunch. Everything I've heard has a solution. People are really smart and resilient. But the knuckleheads who got us into this mess probably aren't the same knuckleheads that'll pull us out. So more people at the table is going to help us come up with this stuff. For me, it all goes to urbanization, and that's global. The Chinese middle class is going to affect more discussions we just had in this room than anything we do. The growing Indian middle class, the consumption and the absorption and their needs. So I think we have to rethink what it means to live, how we live, what our cities live like if more of us live in them. And I think the good news is these are all solvable problems. They really are. They'll be technical, there'll be human solutions, but they're solvable. When Central Park in New York was built, New York ended at 30th. If you go to New York now, their city hall, the back of it, is sandstone because they never thought the city would develop on the back side of it. So change is always going to come. And your challenge will be preparing for it and then doing something smarter than we did or our parents did, coming up with better solutions ahead of the need for them.
Fantastic. Thank you. So my last question, and then we'll open it up for student questions. And students, this could be you asking for an internship. This could be you asking for more advice. This could be something more broadly connected to an issue that is near your heart. If there's time, I will ask Shauna about beaver dam analogs and restoration. I won't force that on everyone like I have all semester. I'll let that towards the end. The last thing I'd love to hear from our panel is a recommendation for a book. So these have already come out in different ways, but we have a book coming out. People like to keep their minds in action. So what piece of literature, what reading, what article, what book would you recommend that students who are interested in these topics get their hands on right away? Anyone got one on the tongue?
I just want you were breaking up, or it was your volume was fluctuating. Was it recommended books?
Yes. I think when my heater runs, it doesn't work as well. But anyway, sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. What book?
Gosh, I got to think about that. Well, one I would say is E.F. Schumacher's Small is Beautiful. I already mentioned that. It's, in my opinion, a classic. Man, you didn't give us that one in advance.
I know. I just thought of it when you said B.F. Shoemaker, actually. That made me want to know what else I should add to my list.
What was the Daniel Sarowitz book that we read in, I think it was in Dr. Alm's class, Science, Democracy, and Environment. Do you remember that one?
It didn't have pictures, so I don't remember.
Yeah. Scott read the Cliff Notes.
Yeah. Well, I would recommend reading my dissertation. It's called Weaponizing the EPA, Wicked Problems in Presidential Control, if you want to look it up.
Oh, that sounds good. That's a paper. Actually, that is a paper. Thank you. Riddle and Weber, 1973, the classic Wicked Problems paper. It's like, but it doesn't say Wicked Problems in the title. What is it? It's like Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning or something.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, that's another one.
Yeah, what Shauna's referring to is a work that's actually been kind of permeated into all kinds of different scholarly works, and it's the idea of wicked problems. And I think Kelli alluded to it earlier. I think she said something about the sticky problems, but it's the same idea that wicked problems tend to be really complex because they're value laden. They're also expensive. Sometimes they're difficult to define. So they tend to be extremely contentious, and they divide it. It's like you think about climate change in the United States. Views on climate change break along political lines. It's one of those handful of issues that defines what it means to be Republican or Democrat. And that is one of the issues why these things are so challenging. I would recommend Theodore Lowy, The End of Liberalism. And the reason why is because Theodore Lowy talks a lot about interest groups and the impact and the influence of interest groups on policymaking in the United States. Now, there are all kinds of views on whether or not that's helpful, but what it comes down to is that the more that the decision making comes out of the hands of the people and the public, and it gets confined to interest groups, the less representative the decision making becomes. And you see that in various public policy models too, whether it's advocacy coalition framework, narrative policy framework, those types of things. Those are all really interesting areas of study if you really are interested in policy. But really anything that will help you get a big picture of the moving pieces, I think is incredibly helpful. And those things are, those works that were mentioned are helpful in doing that.
I'll bring on two recommendations. I'll pick some of that up, Craig. My midlife moment has been recognizing the power of story and place, because they give us a vocabulary around which we can build those discussions on value. And those are both in intensely personal for the people, but it starts, and I brought props because I need them. I don't know, it's backwards. Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey. I'm sure most of you have read it. Read it at multiple points in your life because it's about story. And then the other one that's my go-to, and I put it in the notes, is Horizon by Barry Lopez. This to me is the single most important book I've read in 20 years, every bit of it, because it's an individual who is an author first. He picks vocabulary incredibly carefully and may help you get a narrative of bigger issues that gives you a vocabulary to talk to different people who, like Craig said, authentically come to their feelings in very valid and very different ways. But building the vocabulary to have those discussions intentionally and thoughtfully, I think is going to be absolutely essential for your work, advancing change and healing.
And if I can just jump in there just really quickly, Emily, and to give a shout out to John Freemuth, Alston Chase's In a Dark Wood. If you haven't read that, read it. And that really hits at the core of it, because it gets at that idea of people do come by their values honestly. And the stereotype of various actors in the public space it's just wrong. It's not productive, and it's just wrong. So that's incredibly that'll give you some good perspective and good insight. And one thing we haven't talked about, John Freemus' epic rants yet, but if anybody knew John for very long, John could just riff on just epic rants. His best rants that I heard were at Table Rock. You guys may not even be familiar with Table Rock, but it was Boise's first micropub, and it was incredible. It was really good. But I think the fire of John Freemuth was almost, most hot when it came to people who didn't recognize where their view was, that there were other views, and people didn't recognize that. I think that's where John got the hottest and where he was most passionate, because it does take a bunch of different views to come to a good decision on how we work through these complex public policy land issues.
Yeah, he was particularly hard on scientists. And I remember that as someone with that kind of background. But I really tended to agree with him. There is a certain level of arrogance in scientists that, because we're seeking objective truth. And when you do that as part of your career, you think that it's not only how the world is, but how the world should be. And that's a big struggle. But that always stuck with me. I have such a hard time when I'm faced with people which I deal with a lot of that in this field, but who think that science is going to give us the answers. And really you need insights from the political realm, the social realm, ethics, and it's a lot more than just science.
And Shauna, I thought he ripped on you. I mean, I'm a whitewater kayaker. He used to and mountain biker. I mean, he used to just crush us, just crush our elitist, plastic, Subaru driving, schmucky, douchebaggy selves.
High tech.
All accurate. All accurate.
Yeah, all those toys. And maybe scientists were only second only to deans and administrators in the class.
He had good things to say about both.
Certainly up there with that. Kelly, you put a couple books up in the chat. I don't know if you want to mention those, and I'll give I'll give Mackenzie a chance to be on the panel for a minute, and then if she wants to, and then we'll go to questions. Kelly, if you have a couple comments on those books.
Real quick, I mentioned Your Leadership Edge. That was one of those game changer kinds of epiphany moments for me when I got that book. And the nice thing is it's mostly pictures and cartoons and bullet points. It's very, very easy to read. And I actually take out of my own personal pocket, I carry 2 or 3 copies of that book. And whenever I meet a new leader, like somebody and they start talking about these challenging issues, they are granted one of my books. Someday somebody's going to come back to me and say, hey, I got so much out of that book, but I know sometimes that takes time. So to me, that is something I just can't emphasize enough, how that changed my way of thinking, because it does help us look at things from varieties of perspectives and figuring out how other people are telling stories and how we tell our own stories. And then the other one that really changed the way that we do our work at our whole organization, Trying Hard is Not Good Enough. And this is like an old book. This is like from the 70s or 80s. And it is looking at the way in government we find solutions, and then we figure out how to measure our success. And this sort of turns that upside down, where you figure out what success looks like and how you're going to measure it. And then you develop a solution to support that. So we use that now when we build programs, and we're also using it through our health collaborative to look at population kinds of issues. But both of those books really have very different ways of looking at these wicked or sticky problems.
Thank you. That's great. Now Santa has a lot of things he can put in my stocking. I'm excited about those. Mackenzie, do you have anything that you want to ask the panel?
Yeah, I went through the MPA program too, and I'm still technically in academia since I'm still in the PhD program, but I have a job on the side that's still more academic, but this might help other students as well. What differences did you see once you got out in the quote real world, as I think Dr. Freemuth has called it before, compared to what you studied? And do you have any advice for students who are either going to enter careers after this or after they go to a graduate program that you can't really learn in the academic world?
I guess for me, I haven't really found a lot of those kinds of moments where there wasn't a really good practical application. I think about my budgeting classes and the general administration classes, and how I use that knowledge, I use that experience in the work I do all the time. One of the things that stuck with me was, how important it is to be honest about things and to, build trust. And so when we build our budget, it's always around what we need, not padding it and making it too big, so that when we come back and ask for more money, people value our opinions and see us as a trusted partner. So I haven't really found much that where there's been this, oh, I wasn't expecting that. And I just always found that, again, because it was such a way of applying, it's an applied degree versus a more academic degree.
I'll jump in. I'll say there was a big difference because in the quote unquote real world, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And the amount of relationships that you have to tend with your brand, your credibility is the most important thing. And keeping your big pie hole shut about proving how much you know is more important than what you know.
Yeah, and I think for me, I think when I think about it, because I just defended my dissertation last March. So Mackenzie, you can make it. you can absolutely do it. Hang in there, keep going. It's worth it. But I think that for me, because I didn't work in any of the public spaces, that I was always on the outside looking in, that everything I learned was just important information to be able to process and understand the dynamics of what happens in the public space. And I think that probably the biggest thing that I learned all the way through both the MPA and with the PhD is that not everything fits perfectly into the theories or the models, but when you put it all together and you have a good base and a good background, you can start making sense of things. So really it's that idea of not approaching it with the idea, continue to approach things, information, knowledge, humbly, and know that you're going to continue to learn and grow, but there are a lot of things that you can apply and use to make sense. It's just like the whole, science policy intersection. What role does science have to play in policy? When you hear somebody say, I'm going to listen to the experts, well, it's because they agree with the experts. And sometimes the experts don't all agree. And so that's where you kind of have to go, okay, what does science have to offer? It's part of the equation and it's part of the process and it's really important. But there are all kinds of other factors that come into play in the public space.
Yeah, gosh, I mean, they're so different. It's, being in school is such a great time just to be able to really focus and absorb, and you're kind of in a bubble a little bit. And you get out into the real world, and I mean, that term real world's kind of silly, but I remember things like when you actually have to deal with the public it seems ridiculous that a fish-eating bird like a double-crested cormorant could get people so upset. But I remember going to some of these public meetings because we went through the NEPA process. We were doing an EIS. We traveled from, I was based in the DC area, but we traveled to Portland, Michigan, Arkansas for public meetings. And one of the worst was in Northern Michigan, where, people were just mean, and that's pretty eye-opening. Like you deal with some ugliness when you really get into some of these issues, and figuring out how to handle that, and where you get your solace, and people whose shoulder you can cry on. That's something you learn. So there's that side of it, but I also think of things like emotional intelligence and some of the stuff that it's kind of like you have it or you have to learn it. Good communication skills. especially writing. I think that's a strength to build on, no matter what it takes. That'll get you far. I see Scott just wrote bourbon helps in the comments there. But yeah, managing your time well, things like that are just sort of those skills you learn as a professional. But that all helps and makes it easier, as does occasionally a beer. I'm not a bourbon person, but
Fantastic. Thank you all for all of that. Okay, let's give a little bit of space to the students. Brendan put up a question earlier, and I know he has a solidarity for the urban issues and the urban beginnings. I don't know, Brendan, if you want to ask your question about parks in person or, oh, sorry. Student questions. Am I breaking up still? Sorry about that. Okay. Which students have questions?
I could ask one. Craig, you talked about moving from the private sector to the nonprofit sector. I was hoping you could talk a little more about the transition that you went through and how you see those two kind of domains as different.
I have no experience in the nonprofit sector. I worked in the private sector my whole career. So that may have been, I'm not sure who was that, who had that.
Oh, that's my bad.
It's all right.
Maybe someone could talk about the differences between working in the public and public and nonprofit sectors.
Well, I made the jump, so I'll tell you one big thing. I wish I had gotten more MBA experience. The ability to read a P&L statement, the ability to understand profit, the necessary requirement of profit as a reason to continue existing. I wish, I feel, and I work with a lot of private businesses now, that I had more of that experience. The public sector allows you, in many cases, to get lazy. The money comes in every year. It's a matter of taxation. That's not how 99.9% of this world lives. And being aware of that, I wish I had had a better lens. So that was a rapid mid-career learning for me.
Yeah, and I think from the private sector, Scott's exactly right. Everybody answers to somebody, and in the public sector, it's a whole bunch of somebodies, and depending on with a whole bunch of different interests and values. In the private sector, it can be a whole bunch depending on how a corporation is run, what the board is like, the share owners that influence the decisions that a board of directors make. For example, a great example is the influence of investor groups that are influencing corporations to take on low carbon goals. There are many utilities in the nation, large ones, that are moving toward low CO2 emissions because of the pressure from their investors. Those are all pressures that happen in the private sector. And I think in the nonprofit, it's not so much different. You've got to find your niche, and you've got to create the value in what you're doing. And you've got stakeholders that you have to, relationships that you have to build in order to get the funding coming in. But Scott's right, in the public space, it's a little bit different, where the funding is there on a regular basis. You don't really have to think too much about that.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, I had a question. So throughout this whole semester, we've had a lot of guest speakers, obviously, and there's been a theme of collaboration and coming together with working with groups or people that you don't necessarily agree with. And Craig, you spoke to that today about John Freemuth and him believing that you need to recognize and respect other people's views. How practically would you say you have worked with people or groups where you're coming from like seemingly opposite ends of the spectrum, where you don't necessarily see like anything that you can find common ground on? Like, where do you start?
So a perfect example on that is hydro relicensing. That's always my go-to, because in relicensing you have the power company that owns the plant, you've got the customers that receive the power, you've got the lands that it sits on. Some of those lands may be either private lands that are impacted, but out west it's predominantly public land. So it's the BLM, it's the U.S. Forest Service. Then you bring in tribes, and you guys have heard about tribes this semester. Then you bring in whitewater groups, float boaters, jet boaters, anglers, hunters, and then you have just the straight natural resource impacts from endangered species, from the bugs all the way up to the charismatic megafauna that was mentioned earlier. So where you begin is to find that common ground. And that common ground may just simply be, we have a problem that we need to work through, and to be able to identify and recognize it as something that you need to work through. The only way that you can solve these complex problems is where you have stakeholders coming together to talk. And if there is no communication like that with the stakeholders, there's not going to be a collaborative solution. There'll be a solution. It could be a court mandated solution. It could be a regulatory solution that may not be optimal. But in many of these public lands issues where you have these spaces with different interests, when you can get the people together, get them to talk, find the common ground, build trust, then you can actually start moving toward decision making, and you can get into something that looks a lot closer to deliberative decision making rather than what I call post-deliberative decision making, where it doesn't happen.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that. Craig's right. I mean, I've been in too many lawsuits now to mention. People lawyer up quickly on this stuff because it matters and there are real dollars at stake. Freemouth, y'all should know, if you don't already, what helped many of those lawsuits not happen. And you'll never see those wins. Because they're built over long relationships over a long time, where he was able to play a role in determining who's a serious actor and who just really wants to fight. And to Craig's point, that's all about finding the common ground and not doing the heroic, but doing the mundane day after day after day. The White Clouds in particular stands out as a local example to find who are the actual actors that are serious, where can they take risk within their constituencies that it's safe, and who has the credibility to bring it home.
And sometimes it's really helpful to find that policy entrepreneur. And that policy entrepreneur is somebody who has a high level of influence in the policymaking process. So it could be a senator, it could be a governor, it could be a group of them. But it's find that person who's got the gravitas and the motivation to bring people together. Because if you find that person, they're not just in it for just purely altruistic reasons either, because policymakers have their reputations at stake. They have their futures at stake. Find that person and you can start building a coalition of the willing to actually come through on a decision that makes sense.
And I don't want to dominate. I don't know how many of y'all, I think I can say it now, I'm far enough away. The Foothills Levy, the first one, before many of y'all were even born. I was in the room when Steve Appleton, who was the CEO of Micron, told the Mayor Coles at the time, you may remember this, Kelly, I need the foothills preserved because I'm flying in my candidates from Stanford and Yale, and I'm arranging for their airplane to land at sunset, and I'm seeing them on the right-hand side of the plane to catch those purple foothills. I cannot lose that competitive advantage. So the Foothills Initiative that we all love for recreation, I hate to be the one that ruins it, had zippo to do with conservation. But that didn't matter. It was, to Craig's point, the person who solves things creatively brought the solution forward that everyone enjoys today.
Yeah, and I would add that I really think this is a big challenge for your generation is figuring out how we go from, these competing visions to common ground. And Kelly mentioned earlier that we've solved a lot of the simple stuff. We're getting into, the more complex problems. That's the wicked problems, right? That are inherently hard to solve. So a lot of that is for you all to figure out how can you do that. But I think that's another one of my issues. I think is a big challenge for the future. We've seen it in national politics. This differentiation of publics and sort of a divergence of values in a way that, look at the election, like how close it was. The red and blue, the urban rural, that's going to stick with us for a while. And when you have people that really get entrenched in their camps and have different ideas of how the world works and what truth is, like that is really challenging to resolve these issues. And I don't have a magic wand to do it, but I know like listening and like Craig said, respecting people, as hard as it can be sometimes, because you kind of want to poke fun, you know, at the people that don't think like you, but trying to rise above that is that helps. Just being a good person, being humble, being kind, you know, listening.
So we have a great question that just came in from Riley. I'll let you ask that as our last question, and we're coming up on the end of time, and I know a couple students have class afterwards. If you want to say your thank you and trickle out, if our panelists can stick around for a couple more minutes, we'll continue that. But let me conclude by giving you a round of applause and thanking you once again for sharing all of your expertise and insight with us. Please join me in doing that. And then we can turn to Riley's question here too as a final word. Thank you.
Yeah, so I just had a question for Shauna, just regarding reintroductions of species. You said you mainly did boots on the ground in your work. I was just wondering if you'd ever been a part of a reintroduction of a species. And
yeah, well, I was in Western Montana when wolves were coming back, both on their own and because of reintroduction in the 90s. And then I worked on the California Condor Recovery Program in Southern California also. So I got to actually be involved in actual reintroductions of condors, which was really neat. Yeah, I mean, I'm all for reintroduction as long as it's partnered with an ability to deal with those human-wildlife conflicts that I mentioned. You can't just shove wolves and grizzly bears at people and say, now deal with it. There has to be a way to address it, because if you don't, you're going to end up with like the shoot, shovel, and shut up, you know, solution where people just go and kill them. So we have to, I feel like we have to, you know, respect the people that are trying to make a living on the land and try and make those work together.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Are there more questions from some of the students that are still here that you haven't had a chance to ask? Maybe Brooke or Eli or Daniel?
Yeah, I actually have a question. It's more so for Kelly. You brought up the launching of the electric vehicles. I'm just curious to know more about that launch, I guess, just kind of what the challenges were and what you guys are facing and funding and all of that.
So we were able to secure funding through our Federal Transit Administration grants. We applied for a discretionary grant, and we went through an analysis of the current fuel technology we use is compressed natural gas and electric, and looking at what are some of the you know, in terms of infrastructure, like how does our infrastructure need to change? And it's a pretty complex project because we are geared up for CNG, and now we're going to be going forward with electric. So we were able to secure the funds. I think it's the first launch is about a $9 million project. And then we've got another $3 million coming behind that for 4 more buses. So within the next 6 to 8 months, we'll have 12 of our, or actually it'll be, 12 of our fleet will be electric, and we'll now that the infrastructure is going to be put in place, it'll be a lot easier to keep adding them to the fleet.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Will it change the routes at all, or will it change the sort of procedures, or is it just a sort of conversion of energy?
It's a conversion of our fuel technology. It doesn't change the route so much. What we'll learn as we implement them, sometimes the range is a little different, like how long the vehicle can be out before it needs to be fueled again or recharged. So we're going to have to kind of experiment with that a little bit to see what works. We know what the range is supposed to be, but just like in all things, it's, you know, what they have on specs sometimes isn't exactly the way it turns out in real life. So we have to adapt sometimes, but there's so many things that go into it that I didn't even have any idea about until we went down that path.
It's really exciting though. Thank you for sharing that with us. Erin or Stephanie, do you guys have any other additional questions?
Yeah, I have a question for Craig that I'm trying to figure out the wording in my head for, so I apologize for what comes out of my mouth. But I'm doing my final project on I'm doing my final project on dams in the Columbia River Basin and their effects on salmon populations, and I mean just kind of the history of them. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned hydropower relicensing several times, and I read a report about how, because a lot of dams were built in the 30s and beyond, a lot of those are kind of coming up on their expiration dates or their relicensing time. And a lot of the smaller ones, it seems like it makes more sense to remove them instead of repair them cost-wise. So I'm curious on like the bigger dams, the hydroelectric dams, if that's really a factor, or if we're so reliant on them that won't be, like that will never be a factor. And like, what's the actual expiration date on these dams? Like I imagine at some point you can't just repair them, and they're holding back obviously a massive amount of power.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. That's actually a question that I asked one of our engineers one time. It's like, how long do these things last? It's like Hell's Canyon Dam. I don't know if you've been down to that area, but it's a big chunk of concrete, and it's massive. A couple things that you also have to think about when you're thinking about dams and relicensing. You have to think about who owns them. So federal dams don't have to go through relicensing. So the dams on the Columbia River, those are all federal hydroelectric projects. They're run by the Corps of Engineers, and they don't have to go through relicensing. Private hydropower projects do. So like Idaho Power's dams in the Snake River Canyon, Brownlee, Oxbow, and Hell's Canyon, those all have to go through relicensing. And I can't remember I haven't been focused on those for a while. I don't know if they've actually gone through fully the relicensing process and have been issued new licenses or not. But when a project is issued a new license, they're issued a new license for anywhere from 30 to 50 years. So the life expectancy, engineering life expectancy of these dams is a long time. And so as long as the dam is not leaking, as long as it's sound, that thing will sit there as long as you want it to. And so there's really no, from what I can tell, there's no end of life of those. What happens is that the mechanics, so the turbines, things like that, the actually mechanical pieces of it that are used to generate power, those are replaced from time to time. 20, 30, 50 years, those things get maintenance. Sometimes they get maintenance every 5 to 10 years, depending on what the part is, but they will last beyond your lifetime.
Cool, thank you.
You're welcome, thank you.
I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I kind of have a question related to that. The Eco Northwest report that just came out, I think it was last year, that evaluated the non-use value of the dams at like $10.6 billion if those rivers were free running. And the feds kind of ignored that. Is that just because no one really stands to profit off of that valuation?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with the exact number. I'm familiar with some of the analysis that has gone into it, but my information on it's a little bit dated. But what I can tell you is that those projects, so not one single issue is going to be the driving issue for removal of any of those dams. It's not going to be a straight impact on salmon. It's not going to be a straight cost analysis. Those projects do provide some flood control. They do provide irrigation for agriculture. Those are all big issues and very political issues. So once you start going after the ability to use water and water rights, that's where it gets really challenging in a real hurry. So when it comes to all of those pieces, even though you can have various economic studies to point to various benefits, whether it's from fish and wildlife, non-use benefits, the economic benefits, those are all just important pieces. But what you see right now going on with the Northwest projects, aside from the smaller projects that Stephanie mentioned, which don't have a lot of economic value because they're so small, and then the cost to restore salmon runs is so big that is an economic cost that is easily seen. But with everything else, there are so many issues at play that it makes it really difficult to dive into just one single area that's going to make a difference.
And I would add to that, when you talk about the feds, there really is no collective feds. There's the BPA, Bonneville Powers, Fish and Wildlife Service. There's NOAA, which actually has the responsibility to recover salmon, endangered salmon. So there's a lot of different perspectives, even with the federal government, on what the benefits and lack of benefits are associated with dams. So.
And those are, when you're talking large dams, you're talking, a lot of kilowatt hours. And I think Shauna alluded to it earlier. It's like, what do you replace it with? Because if you're,
it's clean energy.
They're not producing emissions. So, and they're not taking up acres and acres of public space that windmills or solar panels would. They're paid for. There's a lot of pressure to keep those in place. And it would take, I think, and that's why, so I mentioned earlier something about policy entrepreneurs, and you don't see a policy entrepreneur emerging around that issue because nobody wants to take it on because there are so many diverse factors. So if somebody, I think Kitzhaber years ago took it on in Oregon, but nobody else has really stepped up in that way. And just because those interests are so disparate and they're so important that, short of a mandate from some entity, it's probably not going to happen.
Yeah, I sometimes feel like I wish we just had a salmon czar who just, I almost feel like it's the only way to really recover them because there's so many different interests, from as innocent as people that want to live on a little 5 acres, along the river, and they have an impact, but that's what they want. That's their quality of life, up to, logging and the hydro power and all that. So many factors that play into it and affect salmon.
Yeah, and that's.
Shauna, did you just suggest the benevolent dictatorship is the best model?
I didn't hear her say best. I heard it would happen.
I don't think that we should do it, but sometimes I feel it because, we're a democracy, and it's sink or swim in democracy, right? But sometimes I feel that that's the only way we would actually get anywhere. We just tread water.
We've heard a number of times in this class from really interesting voices that the tribes will be that czar. Yeah. And that the sort of focus on justice issues and reparations, and that the art coming out of the tribes is actually echoing that point and sort of digging in their heels on it. So I'll be curious to see how that plays out.
And I actually thought of that when Craig mentioned a policy entrepreneur, that the tribes are emerging, as a really strong voice in salmon recovery. So.
Yeah, but even that's not even cut and dry. You look at Hell's Canyon and the intertribal conflicts happening between the Shawnee Bannock and the Nez Perce. Even that's not, black and white.
Yeah, they have to figure out what collective voice they speak with also. And then you have conflicts between tribal fishers and recreational sport fishers. And
I think it's important to point out that on the issues in particular around salmon and dams in the Northwest, it's not that we don't know enough. It's that there's nothing to actually drive a final decision one way or the other because of the inherent conflict of it. So that's something where it's a great example of science can only take you so far. And then it becomes about politics and about interests. And Freemuth was big on this, which whose interest trumps the other interests in the room. And that's been the case with salmon and dams in the Northwest, and that will continue to be the case until there's the ultimate trump card played.
I wish you guys could be the brochure for environmental studies, because yes, I was just, it's not science. It's not that we need more science to get plastic out of the ocean, right? We need society to act how to act in that coordinated way. And you guys are such an amazing advertisement for interdisciplinary thinking and the sort of integrative connections that we hope our students are doing.